Greetings. Glad that you can be with me again today. I'm Steve Cole, the pastor of the First Methodist Church in Oswego, Kansas, and we're glad that you can be with us today. We're having the sermon for August 14th, 2022. It's taken from Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. Since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of the faith, who, for the sake of the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, disregarding its shame, and has taken his seat at the right hand of the throne of God. May God add a blessing to the reading, the hearing, and the understanding of his word. Recently I knew of somebody that was backing out of their driveway and got all the way out into the street, got ready to start headed down the street when a truck from across the road backed right into the side of their car, hitting the rear door. Well, obviously that person was already in the street first, but the guy in the truck just didn't look. He just backed right out. Well, the police had to show up and do an accident report, and they had to have some witnesses. What happened? Well, of course, there was the driver of the car that backed out of their driveway and gave their side of the story about how they backed out, stopped, ready to go. And then it came time to talk to the driver of the truck. Well, there was a passenger inside the truck, but no driver. Where did the driver go? He disappeared. Turns out he was driving with a suspended license, and he left before the police could get there. And the person in the passenger seat really wasn't willing to say much. Not very cooperative. And nobody in either one of the houses had seen what happened. So what do? Where do we find witnesses for this thing? Well, it just so happens that somebody next door to the driveway that he was turning out had one of those little doorbell recording things and caught the whole thing on video. And so the police were easily to figure out what happened. So the video is actually the witness to what took place. And what the person that was driving the first car was asked, can you describe this guy that was driving the truck? Well, all they could remember was, well, he was about 6 feet tall, kind of skinny, 20s to 30s, had a beard, white, and was wearing a dirty t-shirt. Not much to go on there. Well, they did eventually find out who the guy was, and they caught up with him and had to deal with it. But yet, the thing is how good of a witness was anybody in that? One guy was a passenger, the other one was one driver, but you didn't have. The good thing was there was that video recording that could be used. In our passage today, and what this kind of all alludes to, is it begins by saying, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. Witnesses of what? Well, witnesses of what God can do, or what God does for us. It starts out by telling all these people in chapter 11 of Hebrews is called the Hall of Faith, and it talks about all these different Old Testament witnesses of what they had seen. And it starts about with Noah and Abraham, Moses, and talks about others down through the ages, and we have several people in the Old Testament that are witnesses of what God was able to do then and what God was going to do on into the future. Now, they didn't always get to see what God, like Abraham, never did get to see that multitude of people that were supposed to be his family, but eventually they would come along. But he believed that God would provide those things. Moses didn't get to go into the promised land, but he got to see it. But God promised that they would get to the promised land. Those things took place. And then it goes on after this to tell about about people of that particular period of time, the early Christians. What did they experience? And it says that they suffered mocking and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned to death. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, persecuted, tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and in caves and holes in the ground. That was some of the early Christians, what they had to endure for their faith. But they were witnesses because they were willing to endure these things because of their faith, knowing what God was going to do for them. They had faith that God would one day have something better for them. And of course, we have many witnesses too that came along later in the New Testament. We have the disciples, the Apostle Paul, Timothy, Titus, Barnabas, Priscilla and Aquila, Dorcas, Stephen being one of the first martyrs that was stoned to death. These that endured various different hardships for their faith. They were told that the disciples, all but one, died for their faith, except for John, and John was the only one that lived to be an old man. We have all those, and then down through history, we have people of faith that had monumental influences on the faith. There was Martin Luther, who is credited with starting the Protestant Reformation, and John Calvin, and John and Charles Wesley in the Methodist tradition. There's people like George Whitefield and others. And then there's several theologians over the years that have written many different things that most of us probably haven't heard of, but yet there are many that have written many books and things to tell us about, written the commentaries and that we use to help us with our faith. We have 2,000 years of Christian history to be witnesses of the faith. And in more recent years, we have people like Billy Graham, William Barclay, Max Lucado, Philip Yancey, Charles and Andy Stanley. And for us here in the United Methodist Church, we know of Adam Hamilton. It's and these are just some of the more recent people, but we have all these. As it says, since we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, we have all these people that are witnesses of the faith that tell us about it. Some of them are the big names, like I mentioned before, the people we know well, and then there's many, many others that we maybe don't know as well, but are still being witnesses of their faith and how they live their lives and what they do. Yeah. And in a way, we're all kind of witnesses of our faith and how we live and what we say, what we do. But are we good witnesses? See, we can be good witnesses, or we may not be so good witnesses. There's some in recent years. There's some that were fairly well-known preachers that have been caught up in scandals and caught in inappropriate behavior, and they're not necessarily good witnesses for the faith. So we've got both sides of that. My first job out of college was working for Country Pride Foods in Carthage, Missouri. It's now called Butterball. But I was a turkey serviceman. My job was to go to call on the turkey farmers that were raising turkeys for the company and make sure the turkeys were being well cared for, and if they needed some medication or whatever, to help them out in any way. Most of the farmers kind of tolerated this young guy out of college coming, checking on them. A lot of them had been raising turkeys for several years, so what did they need some young guy coming around and telling them what to do? But they more or less tolerated it. They took it in stride, except for one. I had one particular farmer that didn't like me coming around. He was didn't care for it, and he let it be known to me that I didn't really need to be there, and he didn't need me poking around his place. And he, once in a while, even cussed me out a few times. And one time he even took a hammer. He had a hammer in his hand, and he was shaking that hammer at me, kind of threateningly. The interesting thing was, this same guy attended the same church that I was attending at the time. Now, during the week, when I'd go see him on the farm, he was one way, but when it came to church on Sunday, he was nice and friendly, easygoing. Got along just fine. What kind of witness did he have? Well, that's the thing. What do we call it that? We call that hypocrite? Oh, well. Anyway. And as we say, there have been others, in even people that should have done well. Like we say, some of our pastors in our churches sometimes get caught up in the wrong kind of behavior. And like I say, it's not that good of a witness for us. So we have to be careful about that. Now, what keeps us from being a good witness? Well, the passage goes on to say, let us lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely. Lay aside every weight and sin that clings so closely. Wow. Sin keeps us from being a good witness, the things that we do wrong. And here it's described as a weight that holds us back. I've heard stories of people that wanted to hike the Appalachian Trail. It's it's a long trail. It's pretty rigorous going through the mountains of Appalachia. And a lot of the times they'll start out and they've got all the stuff that they need to go on the trail, and they'll put together their backpack with the different food, utensils, and everything they need, and they can end up with a pretty hefty backpack full of stuff. And they start going, and as they go, they think, boy, it's hard to get going on it. If you get very far with all this stuff on my back. And as they travel along, they realize, maybe there's some things I don't really need as much as I thought I did. And they start taking things out of their backpack. After a while, they get down to the bare essentials of what they actually absolutely have to have. And that's kind of the way it is for us. Sometimes we have those things in our life that we really don't need to have that stuff there, but it's there. Yeah. You also think of people that went on the Oregon Trail. They got into their covered wagons and they headed toward Oregon. And they take things that were, to them, important stuff, things that they needed, dining room tables and chairs and bureaus, mirrors, maybe even a piano, something, things, heirlooms, things that were important to them, but as they traveled along, they found out that this stuff was weighting them down. If they were going to make any progress, they needed to lighten the load. And you'd find that all along the trail, there'd be things that had been cast off. They decided that maybe they didn't really need that dining room table and chairs. They didn't need that piano. They didn't need that bureau or that roll-top desk or whatever they had. If they were going to make it, they had to get rid of some of that stuff. Today we have people that have garages, have two-car garages filled with stuff, and they still can't get their cars in the garage. And so the car, which is one of the most expensive things they own, sit outside in the elements while all their stuff is inside that garage. And sometimes they add another garage just so they have some place to put the car. Or they rent storage buildings. To put all their stuff. Do we really need all that stuff? When we moved from Fort Scott to Girard, we moved from a two-story, 4-bedroom house with a basement and a detached garage into a 2-bedroom house with no basement and a detached garage. We had to downsize quite a bit. We had 2 garage sales. One went before we left and one after we got there. And we're still in the process. We still got lots of stuff in the garage that we probably don't necessarily need. So we're not necessarily any better than anybody else. I also have a shed that has the shed's worth more money than the stuff that's in the shed. Yeah. There's stuff that weighs us down. And that stuff that weighs us down in our life is sin. But it tells us, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us. Likens life to being kind of like a race or a marathon that we're traveling along as we're going through this life. And when we run, we don't run wearing a coat and blue jeans, work boots. No, when somebody running a race, they're down to the bare necessities: shorts, a t-shirt, and running shoes. They don't have all this extra stuff. They don't put on a backpack and run with a backpack. And how do we get rid of all that stuff? Well, like I say, when we had to move from one place to another, we had to downsize. We had to get rid of a lot of stuff that we really didn't need anymore. How do we do that? Well, it says, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. A lot of times we can't do it on our own. We have to go to Jesus and say, Lord, take this on from me. I can't handle this. And there's a song in our hymnal. The song is, Leave It There. It says, take your burden to the Lord and leave it there. Not a bad idea. That we give it over to God and say, God, I can't do this on my own. And I want to use an example of one of those things. There's a thing that we call bearing a grudge. Bearing a grudge. Think about it. Bearing a grudge. And I picture a grudge as being this ogre-like creature that gets on our back and just hangs there. And we bear that grudge. When we have something against somebody and somebody bothers us and we're unforgiving, we don't want to. How do we get rid of that? We have to forgive. We have to let it go. Give it over to Jesus. Give our burden to the Lord. Take our burden to the Lord and leave it there. Right? Looking to Jesus. And I think of when Jesus was walking on water. The disciples were out there in the boat, and Jesus comes walking on the water toward them, and Peter sees him and says, Lord, if it's really you, have me come out to you. And Jesus says, come on. And as long as Peter looked at Jesus and kept his eyes on Jesus, he was fine. He was walking just fine on the water. And a little while later, he started looking because there was a storm, and he started noticing the waves in the storm, and he got scared. He took his eyes off Jesus, and he went. And he said a very short but very effective prayer. Lord, save me. Not very long, not very elaborate, but very effective. Because after he said that, Jesus reached down and pulled him up. Yeah. And those times when we're in the storm, we need to go to him and ask him for help. And none of us is perfect. We're not going to have a perfect life. We're all going to do something wrong every once in a while. It's just part of being human. But the good thing is that he forgives us. He loves us. He forgives us, accepts us just the way we are, and helps us if we go to him and ask for that help. Well, I'm glad that you could be with me today, and we're glad that you could spend this time together. And now away we go, knowing that God goes with us to guide us, lead us, and help us today and every day. Amen.